while since I've done a deck, and it's been a while since I've made one of my $15 decks. And by a while, I mean like, yeah, about a week. I guess that's as long as I'm allowed to give myself a hiatus for these days. I'm kidding. Anyway, I really do think it's a good idea to introduce players to tribal decks that they think are very expensive, and then show that those decks can be made very cheaply and very effectively. So, to show that that is possible, as I've done a few times before, let's go ahead and build ourselves a dragon deck with Zurgo and Ojutai. And for those who don't know, this is one of the partner commander stylings that I mentioned I was going to build more of in a video a long time ago, and then I never got to doing this one specifically. So, here we are. I'm making up for lost time. We're talking about dragons, everybody! Zurgo and Ojutai is a Jeskai and 2 4/4 Flying Haste Orc Dragon Amalgamation Commander. They have hexproof as long as they've entered the battlefield this turn, and when one or more dragons you control deal combat damage to a player or a battle, you look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Alright, so let's get one thing out of the way with how this commander works. Because it says when one or more dragons deal combat damage to a player, you may think immediately that that only counts the one time. So you can draw 1 card a turn. But no, you can draw 3 cards a turn and even more if you put double strike on a dragon. This is because the one or more applies to you, but the player part applies per player. So you can get up to 3 triggers of Zurgo and Ojutai every single turn. And again, more if you happen to have double strike, as that creates multiple instances of damage happening on a player at the same time. However, if 3 creatures damage a single player, you'll only get the 1 card. So, what are we going to be doing with this? Well, we're going to be trying to make a deck that has plenty of big dragons to speak on. Plenty of big guys that can come out and do their job very, very powerfully without having to spend a lot of mana on each of them. Typically, a dragon deck has a lot of high-cost cards. We are going to try to go for some of the more mid-range dragons, which will end up with a lower-to-the-ground deck, but it does mean we will have a consistent combat-focused deck that should be able to get plenty of card draw throughout the game in order to protect itself and keep our opponents on their toes. So let's start out with our 15 main dragons we will be running. There are more dragons than this, but these are the ones that only have the job of being a big or a small threat that can trigger our commander, beginning with the Sprite Dragon. Anytime we cast a non-creature spell, of which our deck contains 22, we will get a 1/1 counter on the Sprite. Past that, it has flying and haste, so it can come down and immediately trigger our commander's ability. Pseudo Dragon Familiar can give any creature that does not have flying, which you can use as a political piece if you are trying to give people incentives to attack each other and not you. Past that, it is a Flying Dragon 2/1 for 3 mana. Not really worth the mana you spend on it, but the Pseudo Dragon Familiar does have that ability to politic with it, so it does have a purpose. Then we have Dragon Whelp. For 4 mana, you get a 2/3 dragon that has Fire Breathing, or the ability to pay 1 red mana to gain 1/0, and if it's used more than 4 times, you sacrifice the Dragon Whelp. Ideally, you just never use this ability, but if you end up using it, please don't sacrifice the Dragon Whelp. Low mana dragons that can punch repeatedly are too valuable for our deck. Then we have the Fledgling Dragon. It has Flying and Threshold. If we happen to have 7 or more cards in our graveyard, then it'll get +3/+3 and gain Fire Breathing, which is a fantastic way to push our opponents down for only a little mana, effectively giving us a 5/5 dragon with Fire Breathing for 4 mana. Furnace Whelp has Fire Breathing and is a 2/2. Skyship Stalker has Fire Breathing, the ability to give itself haste, and the ability to give itself First Strike, all for 4 mana. This card honestly packs a lot of punch for how much mana we spend on it. Then we have the Territorial Hellkite. At the beginning of combat on our turn, we can choose any opponent at random that it did not attack during our last combat. And then it attacks that player this combat if able. If you can't choose an opponent this way, then instead you tap the Territorial Hellkite. This is effectively a 6/5 dragon for 4 with very little downside, as we always want to be attacking our opponents anyway. Adult Gold Dragon gives us access to lifelink on top of its flying and haste abilities. It'll trigger our commander as many times as we need, and being able to recover from other opponents using aggro or burn strategies is a great plus. Furcrag Cunning Instigator is another way to make our opponents attack each other. Anytime our dragons hit an opponent, we goad any creature that player controls. Use this on Aristocrats players to make them swing with their Zilliport Cutthroats. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, if that creature had to attack this combat, then we gain a 1/1 counter on Furcrag, and then also draw a card. So he is pseudo draw in our deck too. Sunscorched Regent is a 4/3 dragon for 5 that will get bigger and bigger as the game goes on, and of course gives us a life gain ability attached to it. Tiamat's Fanatics has Myriad, so we can use this to trigger our commander on all of our opponents all at once if we do not have an established board state. Mordant Dragon has Fire Breathing for 2, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we can have it deal that much damage to any creature that player controls. Rorik's Blade Wing has Flying and Haste. Shivan Dragon is a classic dragon that everybody should respect more, honestly. 5/5 for 6 with Fire Breathing, and Hellkite Igniter has Fire Breathing for artifacts. It gains XO, where X is the amount of artifacts we control. Given that artifacts are the main way we are going to be ramping in this deck, we should have 2 or 3 at any given time for the Hellkite Igniter to take advantage of. We'll also be including a single copy of Stirring Bard. While it may not have the ability to attack as it has Defender, it does have the ability to give us the initiative, which can be incredibly helpful for incentivizing combat throughout the game. It can also give any of our creatures Menace and Haste if they did not already have haste. The initiative, meanwhile, is as perfect of a mechanic as you can find in a deck like this. The minute that we get it, we will get a basic land from the deck, and then afterwards we can choose to either buff a dragon or scry 2. After that, we can create treasure tokens, goad creatures, or make a player burn for 5. If we've made a player burn for 5 or goaded a creature, we can draw a card, but if we've made a treasure token or goaded a creature, we can make a 4/1 black skeleton instead. Finally, the 5th time initiative triggers, which happens at the beginning of your upkeep so long as you have it, or every time you gain it. Throne of the Dead 3 will allow you to put the top 10 cards of your library on display for all to see, grab a creature from among them, give it 3/1/1 counters and hexproof until the end of your turn, or the end of your next turn, sorry, and then suddenly you have another big free dragon to play with. All in all, each of these cards serves a singular purpose. Get dragon on board, punch opponent in face. Very, very simple strategy for our deck to be using, but it is an effective one, so we are going to be running with it. That said, let's talk about the other strategies in our deck, like how to draw cards and stay consistent even with our commander's ability, giving us a bunch of cards on its own. Because we do have a draw power commander, we can afford to have a smaller draw package than normal. So we are beginning with Seize the Spoils, as it has the ability to make us treasures after discarding a card and drawing 2 cards. Pirate's Pillage does the exact same thing for 1 more mana, but gives us an additional treasure for the mana. Coastal Piracy allows us to draw cards anytime our dragons punch somebody. Binding of Thassa and Reconnaissance Mission do the exact same thing. Pirate's Prize is closer to Seize the Spoils and Pirate's Pillage, but we don't have to discard a card, which makes sense given we have to spend extra mana into it in the first place. And Dragonlord Ojutai allows us to have more access to our Zurgo and Ojutai ability of dealing combat damage to a player, and then being able to look at the top 3 cards of our library, put 1 into our hand, and the others on the bottom of the library in any order. These should be enough to supplement our draw in our deck, since our deck is so heavily focused on draw to begin with our commander. It should be noted, though, when you are playing a commander like this, that never gives you the ability to not run draw. That just means you don't have to run as much draw as the 8th card in your hand. Your commander always gives you that draw power if you can get it on the board and let it stick. That said, let's move on to removal and interaction, where we're going to keep our opponents from winning the game ahead of us. Since we are running so many ways to draw, or rather we can consistently draw enough thanks to our commander's ability, we are going to be running a very heavy removal suite to keep the board nice and clean for us. And several of these cards are also dragons, which helps us a ton. A Braid gives us the ability to blow up a creature or an artifact. Exercise lets us get rid of an artifact, enchantment, or a creature with power 4 or greater. The suite of Mana Leak, Negate, and Cancel give us access to plenty of counter spells, and great counter magic is amazing in a deck like this, since people will always try to target us once their life gets below 20, and we need to make sure that we are nice and protected. We're also going to be running a Sapphire Dragon to counter non-creature spells, and then get a dragon on the back end of the ability. After that, we've got Resculpt to get rid of artifacts and creatures, Rip Apart to blow up artifacts, enchantments, or creatures, Jeskai Charm to either bounce a creature on top of its owner's library, cucking our opponent away from a draw, dealing 4 damage to an opponent, potentially doming them for the end of the game, or giving all of our dragons 1/1 and lifelink until end of turn. And Generous Gift allows us to blow up any non-land or any permanent at all and replace it with an elephant that doesn't have flying, so it doesn't matter for our opponents. Chaos Warp can get rid of any permanent as well, but it can get around indestructible. And remember, these also kill lands, which is super important to be able to have access to when people are playing cards like Maze's End and Glacial Chasm. Glacial Chasm especially is one of the easiest ways to stop our deck from functioning, so we do need to have ways of stopping it. Glorybringer can exert itself to deal 4 damage to a non-dragon creature, which allows us even more methods of blowing up cards on the board. Lozan Dragon's Legacy says anytime we cast an adventure spell or a dragon spell, it'll deal damage to any opponent or any target creature based on the mana value of that dragon, as long as we don't target a commander. Tyrant of Kerr Ridge is a Shivan dragon with the ability to deal 4 damage to any target when it comes onto the board. Steel Hellkite can blow up any kind of non-land permanent as long as we sink mana into the Hellkite equal to the permanent's mana value. Horde Smelter Dragon can blow up any artifact for 4 mana. Amethyst Dragon allows us to blow up anything with toughness 4 or less, or a bunch of creatures with toughness of 1 or 2 with its effectively Fury ability by paying 5. And then, of course, we have a 4/4 Flying Haste Dragon afterwards because it is an adventure spell. Drakaseth Maw of Flames gives us a pseudo board wipe, effectively, dealing 4 damage to 1 creature and 3 damage to 2 others, and this is going to get removed very quickly, so please make sure to punch with it on the most prime targets first, assuming you will never get another chance. And then Warstorm Surge. Anytime we play a dragon, we can throw its power at any target in form of damage. Now, it should be noted, this can be aimed at an opponent, or it can be aimed at any creature they control. If an opponent is significantly ahead on life, it's probably better to use the Surge to clear their board out and focus on combat damage to deal with their life. But if they are super ahead on their board and the Warstorm Surge won't make much of an impact, player removal is always a valid option for stopping the elf player from having human rights. That's not how I wanted that to come across, but let's also talk about board wipes. We've got a few of those. Incinerator of the Guilty deals combat damage to a player, and then we can collect evidence X. When we do, it deals X damage to each creature and each planeswalker the player we punched controls. Collecting evidence, of course, is getting rid of cards in our graveyard until they equal a certain mana value. If we banish a single dragon with a mana value of 5, that is collecting evidence 5, and that deals 5 damage to every creature in each planeswalker that player controls. Crisis of Conscience can destroy all tokens or all non-land, non-token permanents, clearing the way against enchantment-based strategies we normally would struggle against. Austere Command gives us similar modality, but we can also blow up little creatures when we do this so that our commander doesn't die. And Time Wipe allows us to blow up all creatures, but put our commander back in our hand where it's safe and sound and can come back down with Flying and Haste to do its job and draw us cards and replace itself. That all said, that is all of the ways we have to remove things from the board in this deck. And honestly, it's a pretty hefty removal package. This may play like an aggro deck, but it's going to feel like a control deck if you play your cards right. That all said, let's move on to the next section, which is how we're going to afford some of our more expensive dragons in the first place. Now, we have to talk about ramp and mana in a very specific way when we're talking about dragon decks. They tend to be very mana hungry, but we're not running a very mana hungry deck. We are, however, running a deck that wants to be very fast and aggressive, so we still need that mana speed that we would gain from a heavy ramp package. So, we're running a 16-card ramp package right now, starting with the 2 mana rocks of Azorius Signet, Arcane Signet, and Izzet Signet. Each of these is very basic, and they give our colors for our deck very easily. That's really all they're here to do. Then we have Charitable Levy, which allows us to stax our opponents out a little bit, and then anytime a player casts a non-creature spell, we put a counter on the Charitable Levy. After 3 of those spells have been cast, then we sacrifice the Levy to draw a card, replacing it, and then get a Plains from the deck onto the battlefield tapped. Note, Charitable Levy grabs a Plains, not a basic Plains, so we can use this to grab a dual land if we have one. Dragon Lord Servant can make all of our dragons cost 1 less, which is fantastic in a deck that wants to play many dragons to get many combat triggers. Honored Heirloom is a 3 mana rock that gives us access to graveyard removal on a stick, which is fucking fantastic. Worn Power Stone's also a 3 mana rock, but it's very basic. It just grabs us 2 colorless mana, which is honestly fine. That's a card that a lot of people don't seem to like for some reason because it comes into play tapped, but I'm gonna be honest, how fast do you need your commander to be? Like, it's okay to play slower games in non-CDH. Then we have Lapis Orb of Dragonkind to give us 1 blue mana and the ability to scribe when we cast dragons, and Carnelian Orb of Dragonkind, which gives our dragons haste when we cast them with the orb. Then we have Reckless Barbarian, a dragon that can sack itself for 2 red mana. Use this to hit somebody in the face, trigger our commander, and then sack it for ramp to play a slower dragon afterwards. Patron of the Arts and Swashbuckler Extraordinaire give us treasures when they touch the board. The Extraordinaire gives us the ability to sack treasures to give dragons double strike, which is super powerful in our deck, and the Patron of the Arts gives us treasures if it dies as well, which gives us board wipe security. Then we have the 4 mana rocks of Hedron Archive and Stone Speaker Crystal. Both of these add 2 mana, but the Stone Speaker Crystal allows us to sack it to get rid of any number of graveyards and also draw a card. The Hedron Archive just draws us 2 cards when we sack it, so we're going to be doing that a lot less often. Finally, we have Genex Astral Hunter and Rapacious Dragon. The Rapacious Dragon gives us 2 treasures when it touches the board, and the Genex gives us treasures every single time a dragon touches the board, which we will use to great effect since we need lots and lots of dragons to punch our opponents in the face. Moving on to the land section, we have 11 basic lands in 3 plains and 4 of each mountain and island. Then we move on to the dual lands of the deck, where we are using Frostboil Snarl, Fury Calm Snarl, and of course Port Town. Each of these are the reveal lands in our deck's colors. We are also running all of the filter lands in our deck's colors that are affordable at our budget. Sunscorched Divide, Skycloud Expanse, and of course Ferris Lake. I am so happy that we have access to more of these lands for budget decks now. You have no idea. Finally, we have our searchable lands with Prairie Stream and Sacred Peaks, which can be grabbed both with our Charitable Levy, allowing us to mana fix way better with that card. Then we have 8 fetching lands. Terramorphic Expanse, Evolving Wilds, and Escape Tunnel are all effectively the same card, letting us tap them to sacrifice them to get a land out of the deck. Ash Barrens lets us basic land cycle to get any basic land we need out of the deck. Perilous Landscape can do the Evolving Wilds thing, but it's allowed to be regular mana when we play it, unlike Evolving Wilds, making it a far faster, far more fluid option. We can also pay 3 mana to cycle it to draw a card if we get mana flooded. Speaking of lands that can tap for mana and be used as long as we need them until we need them to turn into any type of colored mana, Promising Vein and Shire Terrace do that job phenomenally well, allowing us to sacrifice them by paying 1 mana to get any basic land out of our deck if we ever need to. Myriad Landscape allows us to ramp effectively, getting us 2 basic lands of the same type from the deck whenever we crack it. Otherwise, it's great colorless mana. And then we have 8 Omni lands to help us even more with our mana fixing. I'm not the biggest fan of the Thriving lands, but each of them does give us perfect mana fixing in our deck. Temple of the Dragon Queen allows us to add a mana of any color and can even come into play untapped if we reveal a dragon to our opponent or we control a dragon. Command Tower and Exotic Orchard are basic options to include as they come into play untapped. Mystic Monastery can tap for 3 colors of mana that our deck has, and despite it coming into play tapped, I think on a budget it's a perfectly reasonable card. And then we have Path of Ancestry, which comes into play tapped as well, but allows us to scry 1 every time we cast a dragon. Finally, we have a couple of utility lands in Spine Rock Knoll to let us free cast dragons from the top of the deck, and Pit of Offerings to give us yet another way to interact with graveyard cards that would otherwise recur themselves in a way that we couldn't interact with. Again, I think getting rid of graveyards is very important. It's a very, very good strategy when you don't want to, I don't know, die to the Reanimator player. Anyway, that all said, I do think that is everything there is to go over in the main deck, so now we need to talk about how to actually play the deck. So let's get into the gameplay, shall we? Let's talk about keepable hands for this deck. You want at least 3 lands, and you want to make sure that you have some way to ramp. Drawing can come from the commander itself, so we don't really need to focus on that too terribly hard. If we look at our hand right now, we have all of our colors between Port Town, Sacred Peaks, and Ash Barrens, and we have ramp in the form of Seize the Spoils. Honestly, this is a perfectly reasonable hand to keep, and I think we're going to go ahead and do it. We'll draw our opening card, play Port Town, revealing Sacred Peaks to our opponent, and then we will tap it to crack the Ash Barrens to grab a mountain from the deck, since we do need to have 2 red mana to cast a lot of our dragons. Next turn comes up, and we've drawn Drakaseth, who doesn't help us a whole lot, and if we look at our hand right now, we don't have the ability to cast anything, so we actually have a free turn to play one of our very few tapped lands in Sacred Peaks. We move on to the next turn, and thankfully we have enough lands to justify keeping Pit of Offerings in our hand for when our opponent tries to play a Dredge card or other great Reanimator piece. So we're going to go ahead and play a Mountain, and tap 1, 2, 3, and let's play Seize the Spoils, getting rid of whatever the worst dragon in our hand is. In this case, it's the Furnace Whelp. We'll get rid of that, and it'll let us draw 2 and make a treasure token. This means we can cast our commander on turn 4, 1 turn early. We move into turn 4, and we've drawn an island. Let's go ahead and tap everything out, put our commander on the board, and punch somebody, getting our commander's ability to look at the top of our deck. If we look at these right now, we want to make sure we can play a good dragon on the next turn. We have Adult Dragon in our hand, so we don't necessarily need the Sunscorched Regent. So let's go with getting Exercise, since this will give us more options to deal with our opponent's board. We don't need the dragons, but we need the ability to get rid of problematic cards. Next turn comes up, and we've drawn another island. Let's go ahead and tap out and put down the turn 5 Adult Dragon. Now when we attack with both of our creatures, we'll gain life from the Adult Dragon, and we'll get 2 instances of our commander's ability by targeting 2 separate players. On the first trigger, we have a Frostboil Snarl, a Dragon Elf, and a Rip Apart. Again, we don't necessarily need the extra dragons, and we have 2 lands in our hand, so we can go ahead with Rip Apart. The next ones we have here are Stonespeaker Crystal, Terramorphic Expanse, and Thriving Bluff. I'm going to be honest, I think we keep the Stonespeaker Crystal because we don't need the extra lands right now, and I wouldn't mind a little bit of ramp with our current setup. So, with that said, we've drawn our extra cards. Now we are looking at a hand of 9 cards, and we need to discard down. We have all of our colors, so let's go ahead and discard one of our basic lands, as we don't need that right now. And looking at where we're at, we aren't actually ramping a ton, so we could probably safely get rid of the Hellkite Igniter, leaving us with all of our interaction pieces. Moving on to turn 6, we draw Spine Rock Knoll. So let's go ahead and assume that we can play the Stonespeaker Crystal fairly free, and let's use the Crystal and the Port Town to exercise a problematic card off the board. Then we'll play the Spine Rock Knoll to set up a later turn. We have 2 Orbs of Dragonkind, and we have Tiamat's Fanatics. I think the Fanatics is probably the best thing to put under the Spine Rock Knoll, but we do want access to these Orbs of Dragonkind. So this is where we're going to show the utility of cards like Perilous Landscape. We're going to drop this down, and we're going to go ahead and sacrifice it so we can get a deck shuffle before we use our commander's ability. And looking at our board, the only thing that we are missing is extra white mana, so, well, actually, probably extra extra red mana, as we can't cast Drakaseth yet. So let's go ahead and grab that from the deck. Now that we've gotten a deck shuffle, we can go ahead and attack 2 more players with our commander and our adult dragon. This gives us our 2 instances of the effect, and looking at what we have here, we'll take the Chaos Warp, as we want to hold up interaction to keep our board nice and safe. The next trigger gives us access to 2 mana rocks and a Sunscorched Divide. Honestly, the Sunscorched Divide may be the best one, as it will allow us to have more untapped mana on the following turn. We don't necessarily need the mana rocks. So we'll keep it as it is, and we'll move on to turn 7. And on this turn, we have managed to draw a Rorik's Bladewing. This is fantastic for us, but we don't have a way to generate enough damage yet to trigger the Spine Rock Null and get our Tiamat's Fanatics. So we have a couple of options. We can drop the Warstorm Surge so that we have access to its removal going forward, or we can play the Drakaseth down and get access to its removal going forward. I think the best one is the Warstorm Surge, solely because it will put the smallest target on our back. Putting down Drakaseth immediately puts a giant red flag on us saying, we are going to kill you very soon, please eliminate us. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 gets down our Warstorm Surge. Sunscorched Divide comes down, and now we can hold up Chaos Warp for interaction after hitting our opponents with our commander and our adult dragon to get some new cards. Fledgling Dragon is one of our options here, as is Reconnaissance Mission. Let's pick the Reconnaissance Mission so that we can keep our hand strong in case our commander dies, and our next trigger gives us access to lands and a Swashbuckler Extraordinaire. I'm going to be honest, I like the ability to have access to Double Strike right now, so we'll go ahead and take that. Let's assume that on our opponent's turns, we do have to Chaos Warp one of their problematic cards, getting rid of something that would have otherwise harmed us. Now we're in turn 8, and we've drawn Steel Hellkite. At this point, we are very late in the game, but we can start thinking about eliminating opponents. So we can tap 1, 2, 3, and get Swashbuckler Extraordinaire out. And then we can tap 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and get the Rorik's Bladewing out, as it does have haste. Swinging the Rorik's at somebody, we can sacrifice the token that the Extraordinaire makes, and not only did they take 6 damage from Rorik's coming out, but they'll take 12 damage from Rorik's having double strike. Along with Zurgo and the adult dragon hitting separate players, we've dealt 18 damage to a single player, and we've continued to chip down 2 others, getting 3 instances of our commander's ability. Honestly, looking at these cards, it's late in the game, so the mana leak doesn't have as much utility, so we would take the Hedron Archive. Getting another trigger, we have access to an actual counterspell that we can hold up. Cancel, though, is probably the best one, as we have plenty of mana to use it on following turns, and our final hit gives us Draw, Resculpt, and Bident of Thassa. We already have Reconnaissance Mission in the hand, so we can safely grab Resculpt and use it to get rid of problematic cards if they show up. At this point in the game, if we have not seen an opponent play anything in their grave that we are worried about, we may be able to safely get rid of the Pit of Offerings. But we will not know unless you are in a game that simply doesn't have a reanimation player. Let's assume for our discard phase that we can safely get rid of it, and we will move on to the final turn of the game. Temple of the Dragon Queen comes out untapped, as we will reveal the Drakaseth that's been in our hand this entire time. And let's go ahead and go for eliminating a player entirely. Looking at our hand, we want to have enough mana to use our Cancel to protect us from any problematic cards. Let's assume that we needed to clear the way, though, from any other cards, so we're going to cast Rip Apart to get rid of a card, leaving us access to 1 mana from the Stone Speaker Crystal. We need to hold up 3 mana in order to use our Cancel, so this leaves us access to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 right now. So, if we are eliminating several players, we can put the last player in a very disadvantageous position by paying 1, 2, 3, 4, and playing our Reconnaissance Mission. Now, despite the fact that we are not going to be getting massive benefit from our Warstorm Surge or anything else, we do have the ability to hit our opponents for a lot of damage. If we make sure that Rorik's Bladewing and our adult Gold Dragon are hitting the same player, and we are lucky enough to not have to cast a counterspell to protect our board, we can then use the 7 damage we just dealt to turn over our Tiamat's Fanatics in combat. This can deal 4 damage to a player to finish the game off because of the Warstorm Surge, or get rid of a potential flying blocker like a Baleful Strix, and that we still might lose a dragon to that board depending on how many blockers they have, but this does clear the way for future turns. Either way, this is what you would do if you end up needing it, and this still leaves us enough mana to cast a Resculpt to get rid of, say, a Bolas' Citadel on a follow-up turn if players are still alive at this point. Ultimately, you're not playing a lot of dragons. You are playing a few and then holding up a lot of interaction so that people cannot trounce you. And I think that's a very fair way to play dragons. It's not overwhelming to the opponents, but it is very resilient, and if you get board wiped, the deck has maintained having dragons in hand, so it can rebuild very, very handedly. That all said, what would you do if you had a bit of a higher budget for this kind of deck? Honestly, if you're upgrading this deck, the best thing you can do is get more dragons that justify their abilities and mana costs. So things that are huge and have great payoffs are great, but there's also some wonderful lower-end dragons we can talk about, and some ways to greatly benefit from their abilities. Let's begin with a card like Dragon Tempest, giving all of your dragons haste, and also if a dragon enters the battlefield, you get the ability to burn creatures and players as well. Untimely Malfunction is a great way to protect your commander with a artifact removal that also doubles as a deflecting swat, and Chaos Dragon for 3 mana is one of the best returns on investment we possibly can have, and I wish that it was more affordable for a deck like this. Stroke of Midnight gives you more access to removal that is incredibly modal. Sylvia Brightspear can give all of our dragons Double Strike, which is super important for a deck like this that really benefits from Double Strike. Galazet Prismari gives us a treasure token when it touches the board, and you don't even have to worry about its actual ability to turn treasure tokens into a better form of ramp. Just being able to be a dragon that gives you a treasure for 4 mana is enough in a deck like this. Sneak Attack can be used to get dragons out for free and way faster. Dragonhawk Fate's Tempest gives you the ability to burn everybody to death with Impulse Draw. Terror of the Peaks is one of the single best dragons in Magic the Gathering and can blow up any problematic card on a board. Scalelord Reckoner says that whenever a dragon you control becomes target of a spell or ability, which they will, you can blow up cards in retribution. Guardian Scalelord would give the deck some much needed ability to recur things like its artifacts. Goldspan Dragon gives you even more access to treasures. Lathliss will give our deck access to dragon tokens it desperately needs after board wipes, and Scourge of the Throne gives us access to multiple combat steps, which is another way to abuse our commander's ability. And you can probably think of a bunch of other ways to improve this deck, from its mana base, to its lands, to its ramp spells, to even having some more consistent draw, or adding things like Unexpected Windfall and Big Score to double up on the draw treasure ability we are already working with. Honestly, the sky is the limit, and that's not a pun because it's a dragon deck, but it is a pun because it's a dragon deck. Either way, I think you'll find that this deck is incredibly consistent at what it is doing, and it gets to be lower to the ground than most dragon decks, and it gets to play more like a classic aggro strategy, which normally suffers a lot in Commander, so it's honestly fun to see a deck like this just work right out the gate. Fun fact, I actually built a version of this deck for a newer player up at my Commander shop recently, and he's been having some good success with it, so I've been able to watch this thing work in the wild, so that's been kind of nice to see. That said, I do want to know what y'all think in the comment section below. I want to see if you would subscribe to me to build more decks, or if you've got some suggestions for me for any decks in the future. That all said, I do want to thank you all for watching this. It's been a long time since I've been able to make a deck. Again, a long time's like a week, but still, I'm glad to be back on doing this, and I hope you guys will be here for me as I continue to make more and more content. That all said, hope you enjoy. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already. Go to my Patreon and support me if you want to do that. And as always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here. Hey, just wanted to give a quick thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who help keep me afloat and help keep this channel going. YouTube and Twitch are wonderful platforms, but at the end of the day, stability is not one of their strong suits. If you want to support my channel, then obviously Patreon is one of the best ways of doing that. Link is in the description. But I do want to personally thank everybody who has contributed to the channel. Those people would be Red Joker, Purple Poundini, Jemshin, Britzkrieg, Jupe the Malignant, Michael, Ravalern, Mabbity Babbity, Astral Frontier, Autumn and Angel, Nixie Chan, Agamotto, Victorian Alchemist, I'm not saying the last part of that, and you know that, Arcton Arclacier, Kiratorian, Dren Hadamata, Jordan M, John L, Lord Bleck, Smiling Game Master, and Fireshard. And everyone else who supports my channel and lets me do what I do full time. This is a dream job of mine that I never believed that I would be able to take full time, and with your help, I've been able to do it. So thank you so very much for that. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you all enjoy, and I hope you all are having a wonderful time. I will see you all in the next one, hopefully.